My friends, addiction is not merely a matter of bad habits or weak willpower. It is a profound expression of the psyche's suffering, a symptom of inner conflict that demands our attention. To treat it only as behavior is to miss its true significance. Addiction, whether to substances, relationships, or distractions, is the psyche's cry for wholeness. It is an attempt, misguided but deeply human, to fill an emptiness that reason and discipline alone cannot resolve. In my work, I have seen again and again that what we call addiction is not simply an attachment to pleasure, but a ritual to mask pain, to silence the restless unconscious, and to avoid the confrontation with the self. Addiction is a substitute for meaning, and to truly overcome it, one must not only put down the object of addiction, but also discover that which the soul has been yearning for all along. Addiction, in its many forms, often appears to us as the central problem. We look at the compulsive drinker, the one who cannot stop gambling, the individual endlessly scrolling through screens, and we say, the problem is the behavior. Yet from a psychological perspective, the behavior is only the surface manifestation of something much deeper. It is not the true enemy, but a messenger carrying news of an unhealed wound. To focus only on the act of addiction is to treat the symptom while leaving the root untouched, like cutting weeds without ever tending to the soil from which they grow. Addiction arises because something in the psyche is fractured, unresolved, or abandoned. Often, this wound originates in early life, a lack of secure love, a trauma that shattered innocence, a silence where guidance should have been, or a sense of never being seen for who one truly is. When the psyche suffers such injuries, it develops coping mechanisms, and addiction becomes one of the most powerful and deceptive of them all. It offers temporary relief, a fleeting feeling of control, or a momentary illusion of wholeness. But it never heals, it only masks. This is why so many attempts to overcome addiction fail when they focus purely on willpower or discipline. To remove the addictive substance or behavior without addressing the underlying wound is to strip away the anesthetic while leaving the pain intact. The addict, now raw and exposed, will either relapse or transfer the compulsion to another object, from alcohol to food, from drugs to work, from toxic relationships to endless distractions. The root remains, and until the root is acknowledged, it will always seek expression. In Jungian terms, addiction often signals the psyche's attempt to compensate for something missing in consciousness. The unconscious, denied entry into awareness, presses upward with increasing force, demanding recognition. If the individual refuses to listen, the psyche finds ways to make itself known, through dreams, through anxiety, and through compulsions that cannot be ignored. Addiction, then, is a distorted communication from the unconscious. It is saying, you are in pain, you are unfulfilled, you have not yet faced what lies within you. To approach addiction properly, one must first learn to listen rather than suppress. Instead of condemning the addict or oneself for weakness, the task is to ask, what wound is this behavior trying to soothe? What inner voice have I silenced that now screams through compulsion? This shift transforms the struggle. Addiction is no longer seen as the enemy to be destroyed, but as a guide pointing us toward neglected aspects of the self. The beginning of healing is honesty, not only about the behavior, but about the pain beneath it. For when the true wound is finally faced, the compulsion loses much of its power. The psyche no longer needs to cry through addiction once it is heard in consciousness, and in that listening, in that confrontation with one's own suffering, lies the first genuine step toward liberation. The addictive object, whether it is a substance, a person, or a behavior, functions as a substitute for something far deeper, meaning. At the core of every human being is a longing for significance, for connection to something greater than the fleeting moments of pleasure or distraction. When this longing goes unmet, when life feels empty or directionless, the psyche seeks a substitute. Addiction arises not because the object itself is irresistible, but because it temporarily fills the void left by an absence of authentic purpose. Consider how addiction operates. The substance offers a momentary escape, the gambling table a rush of intensity, the endless pursuit of validation a fleeting sense of worth. Each of these promises the addict something that life, as they currently experience it, does not provide: relief, excitement, or the illusion of being alive. But these are false gods, momentary satisfactions that quickly dissolve, leaving the void as present as before. The more the addict chases these substitutes, the more hollow they feel, because no amount of temporary pleasure can replace the depth of true meaning. From a Jungian perspective, this is a spiritual crisis disguised as a psychological one. The psyche is oriented not only toward survival, but toward wholeness, and wholeness is intimately tied to purpose. When purpose is absent, the unconscious responds with longing, and if that longing is ignored, it often manifests through destructive substitutes. This is why addiction is so relentless. The addict is not merely indulging in pleasure, but is attempting to fulfill the soul's hunger for meaning. Yet because the object of addiction can never provide it, the cycle repeats endlessly, driving the individual deeper into despair. It is here that many treatments for addiction falter. By focusing solely on abstinence, they fail to address the existential void. Removing the substance without discovering meaning leaves the individual vulnerable, restless, and unanchored. Jung himself observed this in patients struggling with alcohol. Many did not find true healing until they encountered a deeper spiritual orientation, something that gave their suffering context and their life direction. What they needed was not merely sobriety but significance. This search for meaning cannot be prescribed from the outside. It must arise from within, as the individual confronts their own life honestly and asks, "What is my soul truly seeking? What is the deeper truth that I have been avoiding?" For some, the answer comes through creative expression; for others through service, love, or spiritual practice. The form may differ, but the principle remains the same. Addiction cannot be conquered by force alone. It dissolves when the void it tries to fill is no longer empty. Thus, to see the addictive object as merely a source of pleasure is to misunderstand it. It is a placeholder, a counterfeit answer to the question of existence. True recovery begins when one no longer seeks substitutes, but instead confronts the real hunger within the hunger for meaning, which, once found, renders the addictive object unnecessary. Suppression is often mistaken for healing. Many believe that if they can simply resist the urge, force themselves into abstinence, or cut away the behavior, they will be free from addiction. But suppression is not the same as transformation. What is repressed within the psyche? He does not vanish, it hides, waiting for another outlet, another mask. In this way, an addiction seemingly overcome may simply reappear in a new form. The alcoholic becomes compulsively overworked. The gambler becomes obsessed with risky ventures. The one who abandons toxic love becomes addicted to solitude or fantasy. The energy of the addiction is not gone, only redirected. The psyche does not tolerate being ignored. Every impulse, every craving, every destructive pattern carries meaning. To simply suppress these forces is to miss their message. Jung's psychology teaches us that what is repressed does not disappear, it sinks into the unconscious, where it continues to operate outside our awareness, often more powerfully than before. This is why so many people, after years of disciplined abstinence, suddenly relapse with overwhelming intensity. The suppressed energy erupts, demanding recognition. The crucial difference between suppression and healing lies in the act of integration. Suppression denies the existence of desire, attempting to silence it as if it were a foreign enemy. Integration, on the other hand, acknowledges the desire, listens to it, and seeks to understand what it reveals about the inner life. For example, the craving for alcohol may not be about the substance itself, but about the longing for relaxation, intimacy, or escape from unbearable tension. If these needs are never consciously addressed, the addiction remains a lurking presence, always ready to resurface. This is why healing requires courage, the courage to face not only the addiction but the truths hidden beneath it. Suppression is easy in comparison. It demands only discipline but not honesty. Integration asks us to ask difficult questions. What is this addiction trying to protect me from? What pain have I been unwilling to confront? What emptiness do I keep covering with distraction? When these questions are faced, the compulsion begins to lose its hold, for its hidden purpose has been brought into consciousness. Jung often pointed out that neuroses, compulsions, and addictions are attempts by the psyche to resolve inner conflicts. They are misguided solutions, not meaningless pathologies. To suppress them is to refuse the psyche's attempt at communication. To integrate them is to uncover the true wound and respond in a way that nurtures healing rather than deepening despair. Therefore, true freedom does not come from silencing cravings but from understanding them. When their hidden purpose is revealed and consciously addressed, the addictive pattern no longer needs to dominate life. The energy bound within the compulsion can then be redirected into creation, growth, and authentic living. Suppression leaves the addict at war with themselves, but integration brings reconciliation, a step toward wholeness where the addiction's message is heard, its grip is loosened, and life is lived with conscious intention rather than unconscious compulsion. The shadow, that hidden realm of the psyche where we bury our unacceptable traits, fears, and impulses, plays a profound role in addiction. Every human being carries a shadow, and yet most spend their lives attempting to deny its existence. We tell ourselves we are good, rational, controlled beings, while in secret we wrestle with anger, fear, lust, envy, or despair. To avoid confronting these darker aspects, many turn unconsciously to addiction as a means of escape. The substance, the ritual, or the obsessive behavior becomes a way to silence the shadow's voice, at least for a while. Addiction, then, is often the shadow breaking through consciousness in a distorted form. What one refuses to acknowledge directly returns indirectly, disguised in compulsions. A person who denies their anger may drink to release it, allowing intoxication to provide a socially acceptable excuse for rage. Another who refuses to face their loneliness may plunge into addictive relationships or substances that simulate connection. Someone who represses their deep yearning for freedom may turn to gambling, chasing the risk and thrill that daily life denies them. The shadow is relentless. If it is not welcomed consciously, it will erupt unconsciously, frequently through destructive patterns. In this sense, addiction is not simply weakness, but a symptom of imbalance between the conscious self and the shadow. The more rigidly a person tries to maintain an image of control, purity, or normalcy, the stronger the shadow grows in secrecy. Addiction provides the release valve, a way to indulge what one refuses to admit. But because the indulgence is unconscious, it becomes compulsive rather than creative. It consumes rather than integrates. Healing requires the courage to confront the shadow directly. This does not mean acting out every dark impulse, but rather bringing them into awareness, naming them, and seeing them as part of oneself. Jung taught that one cannot become whole by denying the shadow, but by integrating it, recognizing that what we fear or despise within ourselves often carries hidden energy, vitality, and even wisdom. The addict who faces their shadow may discover that beneath the compulsion lies an unacknowledged grief, an unexpressed rage, or a suppressed longing for meaning. Once these are acknowledged, the addictive cycle begins to lose its power. Ignoring the shadow, however, guarantees its return. It may not always appear as addiction. It may emerge as depression, destructive relationships, or even physical illness. The psyche will not rest until it is whole. Thus, addiction is not simply an external battle with substances or habits, but an inner confrontation with the self we have refused to see. The one who has the courage to turn toward their shadow, to embrace their imperfections and hidden truths, discovers that the darkness is not an enemy but a teacher. And when its lessons are learned, the compulsion to escape through addiction no longer dominates, for the shadow has been integrated into consciousness, and the self begins to move toward wholeness. Addiction flourishes most easily in a psyche that has become fragmented, where the conscious mind and the deeper layers of the self are no longer in dialogue. When a person lives only on the surface, guided by societal expectations, external pressures, and mechanical routines, they lose touch with the deeper voice of the soul. In this absence of inner guidance, addiction steps in as a substitute. It provides structure where meaning is missing, ritual where genuine spirituality is absent, and intensity where life feels numb. But this substitution is fragile, for it only deepens the split rather than healing it. From a Jungian perspective, wholeness is the ultimate goal of the psyche. To be whole means to live in a way that honors both the conscious self and the unconscious depths, the instincts, emotions, intuitions, and spiritual longings. When these dimensions are ignored, the personality becomes one-sided, brittle, and vulnerable. Addiction is often the symptom of this imbalance. It signals that the psyche is desperately trying to restore equilibrium by forcing the individual to confront what they have neglected. Yet, instead of listening, many simply attempt to silence the cry through indulgence. For example, someone who lives entirely in rationality, denying their emotions, may find themselves drawn to substances that dissolve their rigid control. Another who suppresses their spiritual longing may turn to compulsive behaviors that mimic transcendence, such as thrill, seeking, or sexual obsession. In each case, the addiction arises because a vital part of the psyche has been denied its place in consciousness. The addictive act becomes a distorted attempt to feel alive, to restore what has been lost. Healing begins with the recognition that the addictive impulse contains not only destruction, but also information. It points toward what has been excluded from life. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this craving?" one must ask, "What is this craving trying to tell me about the parts of myself I have abandoned?" Addiction reveals not only wounds, but also unlived potential. The path to overcoming it requires not just restraint, but reintegration, the conscious welcoming of the forgotten or rejected aspects of the self. This reintegration is neither quick nor painless. It demands radical honesty and often confrontation with truths that are uncomfortable. But it is through this confrontation that the addict moves beyond mere abstinence into genuine transformation. They begin to rediscover vitality, creativity, and connection to life, not through substitutes, but through the fullness of their being. Thus, the battle with addiction is not simply about breaking a habit, but about restoring dialogue with the whole psyche. When the conscious mind and the unconscious begin to work together, when instinct, emotion, spirit, and intellect are all given their rightful place, the need for addictive substitutes diminishes. The person who achieves this reintegration does not merely survive addiction. They outgrow it, moving closer to the state of inner balance and wholeness for which the psyche has always longed. Addiction often thrives in the emptiness left by a lack of ritual and transcendence. For centuries, human beings found meaning, structure, and renewal through sacred practices, myths, and communal rites. These were not empty superstitions, but profound psychological necessities. They allowed individuals to feel connected to something greater than themselves, to experience awe, and to channel instinctive energies in symbolic, creative ways. In the absence of such rituals, modern man is left adrift. The hunger for transcendence does not disappear, it simply seeks other outlets. Addiction becomes one such outlet, a counterfeit form of the sacred. Consider the repetitive behaviors found in addiction. The smoker's ritual of lighting a cigarette, the drinker's evening glass, the gambler's trance at the slot machine. These mirror the forms of ritual. They are repeated with devotion, they create altered states of consciousness, and they provide temporary relief from ordinary existence. But unlike genuine ritual, which connects the individual to meaning and wholeness, addictive rituals are empty. They promise transcendence, yet deliver only dependency. The very form of the sacred has been hijacked by the compulsive, and in this distortion, the soul remains unfulfilled. This explains why addiction is so powerful. It is not simply about chemical hooks or external habits. It taps into the archetypal need for transformation and connection to the eternal. The addict is, in a tragic sense, a seeker, a soul longing for transcendence but caught in its counterfeit. Jung observed this in his work with alcoholics, noting that what many of them sought was not the drink itself, but the divine experience it imitated: release from ego, immersion in something larger, the dissolution of boundaries. Without access to genuine spiritual experience, the bottle became their poor substitute for God. To overcome addiction, therefore, one must not only remove the false ritual, but replace it with a true one. Healing requires the reintroduction of sacred practices that genuinely satisfy the psyche's need for transcendence. For some, this comes through traditional religion; for others, through meditation, art, nature, or service. What matters is not the form but the function. It must lift the individual beyond the narrow confines of ego, connecting them to meaning, community, or the divine. When this shift occurs, the addictive ritual loses its grip because its deeper purpose is fulfilled. The soul no longer has to cling to substitutes when it is nourished by authentic experiences of transcendence. Without this, recovery risks remaining fragile, for the void persists, and the counterfeit always threatens to return. Thus, addiction reveals not only a psychological struggle, but also a spiritual crisis. It is the hunger for the sacred disguised as compulsion. To truly overcome it, one must recognize that what was being sought was never the drug, the game, or the destructive habit, but the eternal itself. By rediscovering authentic paths to transcendence, the addictive cycle is broken, and the seeker can finally find what they were unknowingly searching for all along. At the heart of addiction lies the fundamental question of meaning. A person can endure immense suffering if they perceive it as meaningful, but even the smallest discomfort becomes unbearable if life feels empty. Addiction thrives in this vacuum, stepping in where meaning has collapsed. It offers, for a brief moment, a sense of purpose. The next drink, the next high, the next risk becomes the goal, the reason to keep moving. But this is a false purpose, one that quickly devours itself, leaving the individual more lost than before. Without a deeper sense of why they exist, the addict remains trapped in a cycle of craving and despair. Carl Jung understood that meaning is not an abstract luxury, but a psychological necessity. The human soul craves purpose in the same way the body craves food. When that purpose is absent, the psyche begins to fragment, and destructive patterns emerge to fill the void. Addiction, in this sense, is not the real disease. It is the symptom of a life unmoored from meaning. One does not escape addiction by willpower alone, but by discovering a reason to live that is stronger than the craving to escape. This is why so many stories of recovery are also stories of awakening. When a person finds something larger than themselves, a mission, a calling, a spiritual truth, or even a responsibility to others, the addictive cycle begins to weaken. The same energy that once drove destruction can be redirected toward creation. The addict who once lived for the bottle may now live for their art, their family, or their service to humanity. The compulsion does not simply vanish, it is transformed, given new direction through meaning. The search for meaning is not simple. It often requires passing through darkness, confronting despair, and facing the emptiness that addiction once concealed. But in this confrontation, the possibility of rebirth arises. Jung wrote that suffering ceases to be suffering when it finds meaning. For the addict, the pain of the past, the brokenness of their struggles, can become the very ground from which a new sense of purpose grows. Their story of descent can serve as a guide for others, their wounds as sources of compassion and strength. To truly overcome addiction, one must go beyond abstinence and into purpose. The question is not merely, how do I stop this behavior, but what is my life for? When that question is honestly engaged, the grip of addiction loosens, for the soul finds a compass that points beyond immediate gratification. In the end, addiction is not only a psychological or biological battle, it is an existential one. The addict is not merely fighting chemicals or habits but wrestling with the void of meaninglessness. Victory comes not through repression but through discovery, finding a truth, a calling, or a purpose that makes life worth living. When this meaning is found, the addictive cycle is not just broken, it is transcended, and the individual steps into a life that is no longer about escaping reality, but embracing it.